Hello everybody, Troy Ryan Wood here from the 3D Printing Doctor Who project. Today we're going to do something a little bit unusual and something of a first for me. We're going to do an unboxing video of two brand new character option sets that have just hit stores in the UK. Why am I suddenly devoting an entire video to looking at a couple of character options B&M sets when this is a channel normally dedicated to 3D printing, the sort of figures you can't get in stores? Because it just so happens that this year, 3 of the figures character options announced for the 2021 toy lineup just so happen to be figures that I built 3D printable versions of earlier last year. As is my policy, all 3 of these figures have now been pulled from the project's lineup, since their goal has always been to supplement the official toy line rather than supplant it. But I've been very curious to get my hands on these official sets and see how they stack up against my homebrew 3D printing efforts. And now, after months of waiting, I'm finally getting a chance to do just that. So without further ado, I'm going to crack open these boxes here, and we'll see whether 3D printing fan creations can measure up against the real deal. That's right, you're about to see a head-to-head figure showdown to see whose creation will come out on top. So before we start comparing these figures head-to-head, we have to determine what sort of criteria we're going to use to judge them. I've settled on 5 metrics that I think are a fairly fair reflection of overall quality. They are accuracy, how closely does a figure resemble its on-screen counterpart, articulation, how well does a figure move and stand on its own, detail, how much fine surface detail does the figure have, durability, how sturdy and play-friendly is the figure, and cost, how much does the figure cost, both from a material standpoint and time and effort involved in creating it. Right, so with that said, let's go ahead and open up the box. So first, just a quick look at the Doctor figure, and I really love the paint job on this one. You can see it's a little bit paler than most of the other figures, but the eyes and just the little red lines around it just really pops a little bit more than some of the earlier figures. Some lovely, great detail on the back of the head. Other than that, it's a fairly standard repaint of the previous issued figure, but it does look rather nice. I think I actually like this one more than some of the other first Doctor figures I have. Alright, and then here we've got the Sensorites. As you can see, this is pretty much a reissue of the previous Axon body, but they've done their best to mix things up a little bit. You do actually have the brand new feet, and of course the head sculpt, and they put the little, I don't know, they look like stethoscopes, the thought sensors on there. And this is an actual little solid piece that's been glued or possibly even drilled into the body. The actual tube part is painted on, but that looks rather nice. And of course we've got the 2 different variants here. We've got the standard worker Sensorite and the Elder. And there's some slight differences between them. You can see this one has a slightly grayer beard, this one has a slightly whiter beard. And of course he has his sash of office, which is a little bit loose, since it's a add-on. Let's compare them to my 3D printed version. So I actually went ahead and produced 3 different variants, because I might as well. And I will say that we probably picked this figure for the exact same reasons. And that's because the Sensorites more or less looked alike, and you can get 3 figures for the price of 1 this way. All you really need is a different head sculpt, and then a slightly different bodies, with the different sashes and the little stripes on the arms. So let's take a look here. As you can see, my versions have very different heads, and that's because I was able to do completely brand new sculpts for each of them. As you can see here, we've got the standard worker, who has his little kind of slightly pointy beard. He also has the little stethoscope deal, but it actually pulls off and attaches to a little hole on the back. And he also has the same weapon, except this time I put a little peg on the end so that it can actually attach at the hip where most of them wore it. You can actually force this into the hands, and they are pretty close. Like I said, I think mine's are a little bit bigger, and that was a bit of a necessity just so they would actually print. As you can see, I tried to get all of the little wire bits. This does not actually have a little cross section. You're supposed to put a little bit of actual wire in there, but I haven't done that. But as you can see, they're fairly close. Mine has slightly larger feet, which I think may be a little bit more accurate. Okay, now I've got the figures all lined up. We begin judging them head to head. On the first measure, accuracy, how closely does a figure resemble its on-screen counterpart, I think mine have the slight lead there. Unfortunately, these ones, like so many character options figures, are forced to use a recycled body, which in this case was a good old Axos, which, you know, is the closest they have to a body stocking body, but it's got these very noticeable horizontal wrinkles which really just don't fit. The original costumes were more of a jumpsuit type, and as you can see here, I've got the lines there. It's got the slightly more accurate collar. It's got the slight protrusion on the back where their little stethoscope thing attaches. I'm pretty sure that basically for the face, they were going from a very specific shot of one of the Sensorites, which has a very bushy beard. And unfortunately, it's sort of an odd shot because it doesn't really look like a lot of the Sensorites from the rest of the episode. And of course, I very carefully sculpted each of mine based on each of the individual heads, which have a lot of little fine detail to them once you look at them up close. They've all got slightly different wrinkles, slightly different brow lines. They've got different beards. The elder here has a very unusual sort of, I don't know, I guess we're going to call it a reverse beard where it kind of grows up, and I tried to duplicate that as best I could. And of course the second elder has a very similar beard, but it's not quite the same. And the second elder also has a sort of rather noticeable brow line here, which I think was just that the prosthetic didn't fit quite well and possibly had to have something molded over the top of it. So in terms of the overall body sculpt, I think mine is ahead on there. Also, when it comes to the little sash accessory, I actually attempted to do the same thing that they did here, which was printed as a separate part that you could just slot over the top. And it just didn't work quite as well. It basically kind of looked like that, where it's a little loose and just kind of sticks up at a weird angle. You know, but still, it's what they could do. I do not begrudge them that, because we all work with what we've got. So I think advantage 3D printing on accuracy. But in terms of articulation, basically character options is always going to win there, because while I try to duplicate the something approximating a character options figure level of articulation, I can't quite get close enough. And that's mainly just because of the way that the materials work. Resin is very hard, and even though I use a flexible resin as an additive, there's just certain things you just can't do with it. You can't make pop-in joints. Everything has to be, basically because it has zero compression, everything has to be sort of slot in. I'm kind of stuck using technology about the same as an old, like, 1980s G.I. Joe that was all made using very hard, very rigid plastic. So I've got the shoulders, and I've got the elbows, and I've got the hips and the waist, and the head, and the knees. And this is a fairly newish knee design that I started implementing with these guys, because a lot of my earlier figures, they actually bent forward, which is not something I wanted to do. So on these ones, I started implementing a new design that allowed them to bend a little bit more accurately and a little bit closer to the character options figures. So in terms of articulation, I'm definitely going to award that one to character options. In terms of surface detail, I would again grant that one to me, especially as they made both figures with pretty much the exact same head, which again, why wouldn't you? Because it's cheaper that way. But obviously, because I can sculpt everything from scratch, I can put in a lot more effort, and that is one situation where 3D printing does have the advantage, but only if you're resin printing. If I was printing this out of filament, it would be blobby and look nowhere near as good as the character options figure. So I suppose I would award that one to 3D printing, but only if you're resin printing. And then in terms of durability, how sturdy the figure is, that's definitely one that also immediately goes to character options, because again, just of the way that these things are printed, they are printed out of a very rigid resin that does not like to bend. And I've started using something called tenacious flexible resin as an additive, which basically gives the figure something of the consistency of vinyl, especially on smaller parts like this that will actually bend, but only on very small parts. Basically, Only parts that are about 3 millimeters or smaller will have any flexibility to them whatsoever, and they can still snap if you bend them too far. So even though this is a lot more durable than if you printed it out of just straight resin, you know, it's still pretty fragile. You know, if I threw this hard enough, it would definitely break. So for that one, advantage character options. And then in terms of cost, well, that one, it's pretty much always going to be character options as well. Technically, the actual cost to print this, if you were printing out a filament, you know, if you're talking the actual material cost, you're probably looking at, I don't know, maybe about 2 or 3 pounds, which is actually less than what 1/3 of one of these figure sets cost. But then you have to factor in all the paint and your time and the artistic skill needed to actually finish painting the face. And this is a fairly simple figure, and even these were a little bit hard to do. You know, I had the luxury of using an airbrush, which not everybody does. But it's, yeah, because really, you're going to get their most money worth out of buying a set off the shelf. That's the benefit of mass production. So I think totaling all that up, I think character options wins this round. Okay, going on to round 2. I'm going to take a look at the Keys of Marinus set. Let's go ahead and take a look at the figures. Of course, we've got the 2 different Vord, who have got very slightly different costumes. You can see one here has a little button up top, and one has a couple snaps down at the bottom. And of course, you've got the slightly different antenna. But let's go ahead and take a look at the Ian figure first, which I have to say is actually a pretty good likeness of William Russell, except around the eyebrows. They gave him really kind of thin, raised eyebrows, while William's kind of arced almost all the way around the corner of his eyes. But still very pleased with this figure, even though, as Al Dewar mentioned in his figure release video, this is not the costume that Ian wore in the episode Keys of Marinus. He spent the entire story, when he wasn't briefly in a parka, in his silk kimono outfit from the previous story Marco Polo, which he doesn't take off until the beginning of the next story, The Aztecs. But at any rate, it's finally great to have a first Doctor companion added to the lineup, and hopefully they'll find a way to cobble together a Barbara and a Susan at some point in the near future. And once again, the Vord are played by our very versatile Axos body. And before I start comparing these head-to-head with my own figures, let me just point out one slightly odd thing about the Vord. For some reason, this particular Vord, the one with the circular antenna, seems to be the one that everybody thinks of as your prototypical Vord. If you see the Vord in books or in comics or the Doctor Who annuals, this is what a Vord looks like. They all wear the diagonal bandoliers and the exact same style of wetsuit, later used by the Wheel in Space and Invasion Cybermen. But only one of the actual Vord costumes in the very first episode actually looks like this. And it was only in a couple of scenes at the very beginning. The other 3 costumes had a sleeker, more uniform look, and with the kind of very distinctive diagonal seam lines. But for some reason, this bandolier Vord is the one that gets all the attention. Possibly because it's the very first one we see, and the scene of it kind of sneaking up on Susan is somewhat iconic for the second ever monster reveal in Doctor Who. So that's the one that fans remember. But at any rate, on to the direct comparison. Let's talk accuracy. Actually, you can see that the figures are fairly similar in general construction, though there is a noticeable height difference between them. And I think here, character options got a little bit closer, at least in comparison to the Ian figure, because one of the things I always look at when I'm trying to build my figures is the height of the actor versus the height of the monster or whatever figure it is I'm trying to make. And the Vord in the story were pretty much the exact same height as Ian. So on that scale, I think they are a little bit more accurate. It feels like the Vord mask and the character options figures are a little skinnier around the face. I mean, obviously it was a mask. It had to go around a human head, and it feels like these are a little bit tight. However, in comparison, looking at mine, they are definitely much larger. So I'd say probably accuracy-wise, if you could somehow take the average of both these 2 figures, you'd have something that was a little bit more accurate. Otherwise, the basic design is about the same. You've got the webbed hands, flippers, but in terms of the actual suit detail, only this one Vord, the circular antenna Vord, actually wore a bandolier. None of the others wore one. So technically this guy should not have a bandolier. And then of course you've got the actual suit detail here, which I definitely was able to create more accurately. You can see in the actual episode that it's got these very distinctive diagonal seam lines on the front and on the back, all of which are not present on the character options version because they had to recycle a body. So in terms of accuracy, it's a very slight edge, but I will suppose I will give that to my own figure just because the suit is more accurate. In terms of articulation, again, gonna have to go immediately with character options. While I did my best to replicate the character option style movement, you've got your knee and your hip and your waist movement. It does not have wrist, or, you know, and also you notice I have these glued down to a bit of foam core, and that's because the figure tends to fall over. So that's just the nature of dealing with 3D resin printing. So articulation, advantage character options. In terms of detail, the fine surface detail, I'd say that's actually pretty much a tie there. I mean, obviously I was able to get the little seams, but there's not really a whole lot of surface detail that this one is missing. I mean, we've both got the little grill holes around the ears. You know, the hands are clearly webbed. So like I said, they are pretty similar in that regard. So I can't actually score that one. So I'm going to say that one's a tie. Durability, obviously, again, advantage character options. These are actually made out of a nice rubbery vinyl, and you know, you can drop them and bang them on the floor and they'll bounce right back. Can't really do that with resin. And then again, cost, exact same as before. Character options is always going to win in terms of cost because even from a material standpoint, well, I suppose you don't kind of spend too much time painting this guy because he's all black, but still, it's still going to be cheaper to buy an off-the-shelf figure than pre-printing one yourself. So, totaling that all up, again, character options wins this round as well. Alright, so round 3 here is a little bit harder to judge side by side because the set in question has not come out yet. But it's the 5 Doctors set, which of course comes with a Raston Warrior robot, which again is another one of those figures that I created myself last year. So even though you can't see them side by side, obviously you know what you're getting. You are getting another Axos body, repainted, with slightly different hands and a new head sculpt. And so side by side, they are pretty similar. At least in terms of the basic design. They've got the 3-fingered hand, and you can see they at least attempted to put the figure into a bit of a crouch. It's a bit of a cheat there because the legs of character options figures do bend out. You can make them do the split, so they're just slightly split apart there. You can stand up straight, obviously, as you can see by that photo. But let's see, so go ahead comparing these guys side by side. In terms of accuracy, again, I have to say I'm not particularly thrilled. I think this figure is actually hurt more by using the Axis figure than the other two in terms of realism compared to the outfit that's worn on set. Just because the body stocking worn by the Raston in the 5 Doctors is very, very tight. I mean, this looks like a loose sweater in comparison. And obviously, I did my best to recreate the actual very tight fitting body stocking look. The actor that was in this costume was a ballerina, or I'm sorry, was a ballet dancer because I assume he was male, and you know, obviously had a very athletic body, so you can actually see the muscles. He's got his little Raston crack there, and also the little seam up the back, which is, I'm assuming, is going to be missing from the character options version. Also, you can't really see it on the painted version, but the actual model, I even replicated. There's a little tiny rip in the costume right here under the armpit. But so it is there on the 3D model. Can't really see it now that it's been painted. So again, pretty much same scoring as last time. Accuracy, to have to give that to myself, Definitely this time, because the actual model here that I made is far more accurate. Though in articulation, definitely going to give that one to character options. Unfortunately, because I made this so accurate that it has very skinny, I was not able to do the articulated shoulders. So you've got just pretty much just straight one point of articulation shoulders. He can put his hands above his head like that, but you can't actually make them outstretched, and he can't do the YMCA pose. So that's unfortunate, but that was just what I was dealing with at the time. Oh yeah, and also his little boots there, which again I managed to duplicate, I think, a little bit better than probably what character options is going to be able to do. You can't really see them in the up-close photos, but pretty sure that's a little more accurate. So, in terms of detail, again, definitely advantage 3D printing. There's a lot of fine surface detail on this. You can see the individual muscles and the little spine ridges up the back. Durability, always going to be character options. And cost, always going to be character options. So there you have it. Character options wins all 3 rounds. While these repaint and minor resculpt jobs may lack the accuracy of previous waves of figures, they are still good quality, legitimate toys that can be played with out in the sandbox by children, rather than fragile, souped-up Airfix kits, which is basically what I'm producing. And while yes, it is disheartening to have to pull 3 figures I worked very hard on from the lineup, it just goes to show what an unexpected surprise it was to hear that we'd be even getting these figures in the first place. Had I suspected that Character Options would be releasing brand new Alien figures in 2021, I would have held off and focused my efforts on my usual non-humanoid figures. But it has been so long since we had got a brand new alien monster that wasn't a Dalek or Cyberman. In fact, the last one was back in 2012, 2013, with the different versions of Sutek, that I thought for sure we were destined for a future of mostly reissues with the occasional new companion or minor costume alteration thrown in. Really, frankly, jaw-dropping that 9 years later, we're suddenly getting 3 brand new aliens, 2 of them from the Hartnell era, which is woefully underrepresented in the official toy line. And while I am out a little bit of time and effort, there were techniques that I picked up when making the Sensorites figures that will help out a lot in future figure designs. So the knowledge picked up along the way is not wasted. And finally, while character options do great work, these figures here are the exceptions to the rule. I don't expect there to be too many more overlaps like what happened this year in the future, since there really aren't more than a handful of classic monsters left that you actually can create using stock parts and new head sculpts. And now that I know that they're leaning that direction, I'll end up giving those particular figures a wide berth and focus my attentions on the sort of monsters that I know there's absolutely no chance of character options ever releasing unless the global economy does a complete 180 backflip and resets itself to the same state it was in about 15 years ago. So I've got my work cut out for me in the uphill battle to make sure that every classic series monster eventually gets a figure. And who knows, maybe by the time I get to the end, it really will be possible for homebrew 3D printing figures to square off toe-to-toe with the real deal. So, I will keep adding to the lineup, and character options, I will see you in the rematch.
But you will fight the dark side of my mind. The dark side of